All right, good morning, everyone. This is Brendan Jordan with the Great Plains Institute, and I want to thank you for joining the webinar this morning on the benefits for electric vehicles in clean fuels policy. We're going to be organizing a series of webinars dealing with sort of fuel-specific issues with a clean fuel policy to talk specifically about how a clean fuels policy could benefit specific types of clean fuels. I think a lot of times people hear clean fuels and they assume that that refers to, liquid fuels like biofuels, but in existing clean fuels policies like the policy in California, Oregon, and in other locations, electricity is an eligible clean fuel and a clean fuel that can benefit quite a bit from this type of policy framework. Great Plains Institute, in partnership with some other organizations in the clean fuels space, has been leading a stakeholder dialogue in the Midwest for the last 2 years, looking at the possible applicability of clean fuels policy for our region to help advance our own goals around increased production and use of a whole variety of different clean fuels through a technology neutral approach that supports a portfolio of different clean fuels and helps achieve greenhouse gas reductions in the transportation sector and other economic and environmental goals. As a follow-on to a white paper that the Clean Fuels Initiative released in January of this year, we're hosting this series of webinars. So again, this will be the first one. Today is focused on the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which was the first clean fuels policy, and how that policy supports California's transportation electrification goals. We'll be having a second webinar in the series focused on the Midwestern recommendations and how those would be expected to impact electrification in the Midwestern region. With no further ado, I'd like to launch into our content for today, and thank you again for joining. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, which we will do through the chat box. So, and we'll show you later how to do that. But feel free to type in your questions as they occur to you, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible at the end. For our agenda today, we're going to hear some different perspectives. First, a couple of perspectives at a high level explaining how this policy works in California with the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And then we'll hear some perspectives from organizations operating electric vehicles in the California market to learn more about how this policy specifically supports their efforts. I'd like to offer our thanks to some of the foundations that support the overall Clean Fuels Initiative work in the Midwest, including the McKnight Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, and Spitzer Charitable Trust. Also offer a thank you to some of the organizations that helped organize this webinar and help us identify great speakers, including CalSTART, the California Electric Transportation Coalition, and Plug-in America. Our first speaker is Eileen Tutt. Eileen Tutt is the Executive Director of the California Electric Transportation Coalition and worked in California state government for over 15 years and has played a huge role in supporting California's leading policy framework around electric transportation. Eileen, thank you very much for joining us. I'll turn this over to you now.
Thank you, Brendan, and thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this discussion today. I'm really looking forward to it. I also just want to recognize the work of the Great Plains Institute and really especially the collaborative way they've brought together all the different alternative fuels, including electricity, but also the biofuels, as Brendan pointed out. A lot of people, when they think of fuel, they think of liquid fuels, but electricity is also one of the fuels, and the Great Plains process has included us in all of these discussions, and I've really appreciated that. So I just want to give them a shout out for that. For those of you that may not be familiar with the California Electric Transportation Coalition, we are a nonprofit trade association. We're based in California, and we're committed to electrification across all segments of the transportation sector. So that includes cars, trucks, off-road equipment. Our board is made up of utilities, the 5 largest utilities in California, and 2 organizations that represent municipal utilities in California. Our members also include many of the large automakers that you might recognize, Ford, General Motors, those kinds of automakers, as well as electric truck makers and the charging infrastructure providers or the electric vehicle service providers. We've long worked with other states and regions around the country in support of transportation electrification. And it may surprise you that we view the low carbon fuel standard as one of the most effective transportation electrification policies in California. And some of you may know that California is a particularly regulation-rich state. So I think it's saying a lot to say that the LCFS, relative to the numerous other state policies supporting clean transportation, is, in our opinion, considered one of the most successful to getting us to a zero-emission transportation future. The success of the low carbon fuel standard can be delineated in its decade-plus history. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history, and I apologize if it's, but I think it's interesting because it just, to me, it demonstrates how successful this policy has been. It started with the direction by a Republican governor, Governor Schwarzenegger, in 2007 in an executive order that directed the Air Resources Board, or California Air Resources Board, to adopt a low carbon fuel standard that would reduce the carbon content of transportation fuel as an early action item to meet the landmark greenhouse gas regulation legislation that had just been adopted. So at the time, as Brendan noted, I actually was working as an appointee for Governor Schwarzenegger, and I was a very, very strong supporter of the low carbon fuel standard. I still am, for different reasons in some cases, but largely for the same reason. At the time of its adoption by the Air Resources Board in 2009, the low carbon fuel standard required a 10% reduction in the carbon intensity of transportation fuel by 2020. Those who supported the low carbon fuel standard and designed it envisioned a program that was really about cellulosic ethanol. That was what we all thought would happen with some biofuels. We all thought we've got to diversify the transportation fuel sector because our addiction to oil is strangling our economy. We need more diversity in this fuel sector. And so there was just a lot of people that thought, really, this regulation is about incentivizing cellulosic ethanol and other biofuels production. Both policymakers and academics did not foresee the program becoming a key policy in transitioning our transportation fuel supply to clean electricity. So that was just an unanticipated benefit of adopting such a flexible program. In my mind, the fact that the low carbon fuels standard resulted in surprisingly different outcomes than the regulators predicted and was fully implemented and fully complied with by the regulated industry on time, in my opinion, is one of the biggest indications of a successful policy. In California, we have a lot of examples of policies that get adopted and then get almost always weakened over time. That is not what happened with a low carbon fuel standard. And although there were predictions about what the most likely fuel outcomes were going to be or future fuel scenarios, those predictions did not result in command and control regulations. The low carbon fuel standard relied on the market to find the lowest cost, most effective ways to decarbonize and diversify the transportation fuels market. And one of those lowest cost, least carbon intensity fuels happens to be electricity fuel. Electricity in California is very clean, and we have very stringent renewable resources requirements in California. So the grid just keeps getting cleaner and cleaner. And that means that cars and trucks that use electricity fuel rather than oil or diesel, or gasoline or diesel, actually get cleaner as they age, whereas your traditional oil car or truck tends to get dirtier as it ages. It pollutes more. So that is a benefit of electricity, and it continues through, which means those cars and trucks generate even more credits because the credits are worth more because they're lower carbon intensity. So it turned out to be a big benefit for electricity fuel. In the case, I just want to give you one example of where the low carbon fuel standard generates credits for electricity fuel used, and that is the case of a transit bus. So a transit bus in California, the average transit bus, one bus, if it uses electricity fuel, generates about $10,000 per year per bus in LCFS credit value. And that's a result of using the electricity fuel in that bus and then selling the credits generated from the use of that fuel into the market to the regulated entities, which happen to be the oil companies. In perhaps the most obvious indication of success of the low carbon fuel standard, in 2018, 2 years before it was scheduled to meet its 10% requirement and on track, CARB readopted the LCFS with a more stringent mandate of 20% carbon reduction in transportation fuels by 2030. So, again, not only were the regulations largely complied with within the time frame, which is not always the case, it was then extended out another 10 years to 2030 and made more stringent. And as with all successful policies, the LCFS has been amended. It has been strengthened and improved based on lessons learned during implementation. And I will say that as other states adopt this program, they've improved upon it and learned from some of the mistakes or some of the just ways that you could simplify it relative to what California did. So I think it continues to improve as it goes forward. During that readoption process in 2018, there were amendments that were made specifically to the electricity fuel parts of the regulation. So the amendments were largely to correct some of the unanticipated bias in the regulation that was due to the fact that no one anticipated this regulation applying to non-liquid fuels. So for example, unlike all other fuels, electricity fuel didn't have a renewable pathway option. So if you could show that you were using renewable electricity to fuel your vehicle, you couldn't generate additional credits, which is unlike any other fuel in the program. So that was amended to allow for renewable pathways for electricity. In addition, acknowledge some of the electricity's unique characteristics as a fuel. It is just physically, from a physics perspective, quite different from a liquid fuel. So for example, in California, we currently curtail, which means we don't use renewable electricity that's being generated during peak solar times, for example. And that's because we overproduce solar during certain times of the day, and that problem is anticipated to grow worse as we shift more and more towards renewable resources for our electricity generation. And so the low carbon fuel standard was redesigned to recognize the grid benefits and environmental benefits that result from refueling your electric cars or trucks and avoiding any curtailment. So we better utilize the renewable resources that are coming onto the grid. My colleagues, Dean Taylor and Melody Black, who are experts in the LCFS in California and in other states, will go into more detail regarding the specifics of LCFS and electricity. But I will just close by saying that we now have over a decade of implementation of the low carbon fuel standard in California, and it survived many lawsuits and the wrath of the most powerful industry in California, which happens to be the oil industry, which is unused to being challenged in its dominance of the transportation fuels market. So I would say the LCFS continues to be a very successful program in California. the program has been embraced by other states and British Columbia, and it's clearly going to expand its reach as other jurisdictions note its success in California. Again, I want to really thank the Great Plains Institute for the work they've done in kind of organizing us in the Midwest. I think the success of this LCFS, at least in California, it can be measured directly by the fact that our fuel pool is increasingly diverse, and it's providing concrete, real incentives for zero emission electric cars and trucks just because they reduce the highest amount of carbon, while also recognizing the benefits of all of the other fuels, as Brendan noted. So with that, I really appreciate your time, and if there are any questions, I look forward to hearing them. And thanks again, Brendan, and those who helped organize this.
Thank you so much, Eileen. Great intro, and we're going to move right along to Dean Taylor with Plug-in America, who has many years of experience working on LCFS and a whole variety of other EV-related policies in California. Dean, I believe you do have some slides you're going to share, so I think you're free to do that right now.
I think you need to give me screen sharing privilege, please.
Okay.
If you go to participant, I believe you can do it. Maybe I'll just get started. I'm going to go a little bit into the weeds here of the mechanics of LCFS. Like Eileen, I have a long background. I go back to 2006, to the very beginning of LCFS, and I have a long history working for a utility in California until I took early retirement about 18 months ago. And now I'm presenting on behalf of it still says I can't share, sorry. So you'll have another webinar on this where Great Plains Institute will have ICF go into the nitty-gritty details regarding some of the values of LCFS, but I just want to give you a high-level examples. So for example, in the light-duty area in California, it's worth about $500 per EV charging at home per year. And that's at the current prices of around $200 per ton. If you're in a workplace charging or fleet charging example, then you probably can there. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Dean, but we see
I can see it, but it's not in slideshow mode yet, but we can see it. And apologize for the delay in transferring it to you.
So I can continue on the big picture value. If you're in a workplace charging or fleet, you might be able to get $1,000 or $2,000 per EV per year by sharing ports and having more usage of that. And perhaps in a public DC fast charge setting might even get higher, up to $3,000, $4,000 per year. If you're a fleet, Eileen mentioned $10,000 per year for a bus, but if it's a smaller vehicle, let's say a van, it's probably around $2,500 per year per EV, and $5,000 if you have a delivery truck, let's say class 4 to 6 delivery truck. There are some unusual use cases. If you had a class 8 truck running an awful lot of miles, you could get up really high, like $40,000 per year per truck. So you see the numbers vary a lot. We'll go into some of the details later on why that is, but I wanted to give you a flavor. That's obviously very conditional on the price I said of $200 per ton. But there was a time about 5 years ago where credit prices were much lower in California, about $20 a ton. So you could take those numbers I just said and cut them by 90%, 10 times less. So just wanted to give you a high level sense of the values. So obviously the price per ton is extremely important to the overall values. These slides I'm going to show you, you can see off of the CARB website. They have a data dashboard. This is basically showing what Eileen is telling you, how it is a 10% carbon intensity reduction was the original goal. They extended that so 10% by 2022, and now it's going to be 20% by 2030. And then the green line is the compliance line, how they've actually met that through a combination of fuels, as shown on this chart. So just maybe focus on the right-hand side where it says credits. Up at the top, you'll see this section here on that's the electricity section. So electricity is a part, but there are obviously a lot of other fuels, including renewable diesel, biodiesel, ethanol, a little bit of fossil natural gas are some of the major contributors, and biomethane as well. But to Eileen's point, electricity was almost non-existent in the early years. So it obviously grows. To give you just a hypothetical example, I said for residential EVs, $500 per year. So you have 1 million EVs someday in Minnesota, let's say. That's $500 million per year coming in. So it on the other hand, if you only have a tenth of that, then it's only $50 million per year, or 100th of that, it's only $5 million per year. So it's very dependent on how many EVs you have in your state, and it causes this interesting situation where you have a lot of credits in the later years and not as many in the early years to work with, to build programs with. This slide is simply showing the differences between credits and deficits. Credits are generated by the lower carbon fuels, and the deficits are created by primarily gasoline and diesel. And then the green line is showing the banked credits. And it also maybe helps see that as the market has gotten tighter, the prices have gone up. That's why they're probably not, there's a lot of uncertainty in the early years due to lawsuits and others. It's probably why the prices were down also so very low at $20 per ton versus $200 per ton. This chart is showing the different ways that credits are generated as well as the amounts. So CARB, believe it or not, has over 200 different types of credits generated by the different types of fuels. This is showing that electricity here in the green is a very large generator, and it's right around 21 grams per megajoule carbon intensity. The black line here at about 90 grams is the compliance line. I'm not going to go through all of this, but you see that, like, for example, this one is kind of interesting. The bio CNGs have a wide range, from negative all the way up to maybe 90 grams per megajoule, and the average is right around 30 to 40 grams per megajoule for the bio CNG. I'll explain more a little bit if we have time on how we get to that 20 grams, because it uses this funny term EER adjusted, which is a little bit complicated. So I've already talked about the value. LCFS is also part of a suite of California programs. So California, in a sense, kind of divides things up on requirements on the vehicle manufacturers, other requirements for the fuel sector, such as LCFS, and then other requirements on transportation planning to reduce vehicles' miles traveled. On the vehicle sector, we have many mandates on car and truck makers, bus makers, airport shuttles, and more. So there's a lot of different requirements for the vehicles to be produced, but the LCFS is very much a fuels standard. The other thing is this general philosophy I think CARB has regarding the electricity program is we feel that one of the key things that motivates them is they don't want credits to go unclaimed. So for example, they allow for estimation of credits in the residential sector, and they also have a clear hierarchy on who is first in line and second in line to generate credits. And that was slowly worked out over time. On the residential side, their main philosophy is that it should benefit the EV consumer. That also evolved. It was different in the beginning, but that's how it is now. They also, on the non-residential side, feel that the credits should go to the site host as they are investing in and owning the fueling infrastructure. And when I say site host, I mean the owner of the electric vehicle supply equipment or charging station, whether that is the tenant on the property or the actual property owner, whoever's owning the stuff in a commercial sense, that's oftentimes a renter of the property. In addition, I think CARB wanted political support from a wide diversity of parties to help support this because it was controversial. Sometimes there were efforts with lawsuits or in the legislature, and they wanted as many parties to stand up supporting it. So you'll see later, some of it is going to benefit electricities, others to the site host, and other parties also can get the credits, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. This philosophy is a little bit different than what they were thinking of for some of the other fuels. So for the biofuels, for example, they were mainly thinking about how to encourage the biorefinery or the fuel producer. So because electricity power plants and others didn't really need that, they put it further downstream in the fuel supply area, down towards, like I said before, the site host. The other, getting further into the weeds, it's important to recognize that this is a voluntary program for both utilities and the site host. You don't have to do it. Earlier on, they were calling the utilities regulated parties, but CARB changed that terminology so that neither the site host or the utilities are a regulated party, but they're called a reporting entity. Again, most, like 98% of the electricity supply from utilities have opted in on a voluntary basis. And they also can bank the credits without limit. So in fact, there's no, you can bank them for years and years and years if you need to build up enough to have enough war chests, so to speak, to create a program. I think we've already talked about the price of credits. As far as the carbon intensity number, it is basically a statewide average is what everybody uses. There is the option for a special fuel-specific pathway, and some site hosts, for example, may want to do that. But so far, this has not been a popular option. None of the utilities or site hosts have taken that option. The key variable to calculate all of this, the formula seems kind of complicated, but it actually isn't. It all really depends on kilowatt hour. So earlier when I was referring to these large differences like $500 per year versus $10,000 per year or more, it really comes down to how many kilowatt hours of fuel did you use. The other variables in the formula like carbon intensity or EER rarely change. So, you know, the real key here is the more kilowatt hours you use, the more LCFS credits you have. And so heavier vehicles are less efficient. They tend to generate more kilowatt hours, and thus they're reducing more carbon, and thus they're getting more LCFS credits. So as a result, it can take a while to build up enough money to launch, a program. And that's one reason why the California utilities, even though they were earning credits as early as like 2011, 2012, a lot of the programs were launched in the 2016-17 period because it took a while to have enough. As far as the EERs, suffice it to say, EERs are very kind of challenging to explain. There are different EERs for different types of transportational electrification for light duty, heavy duty, forklifts, buses, motorcycles, and so on. The EER basically is used to divide your carbon intensity to get this EER adjusted EER. So carbon intensity of electricity state average grid is up around 81 grams per megajoule. You divide by the 3.4 and it goes down to the numbers that you see right around 20 grams per megajoule. It goes even lower for the trucks, which have a higher EER of around 5, can get down as low as like 15 grams per megajoule. So EER is technically a dimensionless number. It's basically comparing the powertrain efficiency of an electric vehicle to a counter fuel like gasoline or diesel. And it's meant to basically create a wells to wheels type situation so that you're treating that. So both hydrogen fuel and electricity receive the EERs, and the other fuels which don't use electric powertrains don't receive that. My last slide is to go a little bit into the detail here regarding the residential LCFS and non-residential LCFS. The CARB basically found it unrealistic to expect the EV drivers would generate the credits and fill out reports annually and then sell the credits to the oil companies to generate cash. And they originally thought that maybe the utilities could measure all the credits, but then they realized that that was not really feasible, that separately metered utility rates were not getting a lot of uptake by customers. So as a result, CARB estimates these credits and gives them to the utilities. They're worth about 3,200 kilowatt hours per year. And they also found that it was easier to regulate the investor-owned utilities and publicly owned utilities to be the middleman to generate these credits and then give the benefits to the EV drivers, because the utilities are also regulated by a PUC or a municipal governing board. And for various reasons, the state couldn't do it because of the nature of the thing, and other private sector entities were not regulated and could use it to, for their business models and their profits. So CARB has opted on the residential side to have almost all the credits going to the electric utilities. If we have time, there are some exceptions for the incremental credits that Eileen mentioned. On the non-residential side, originally CARB thought these credits also might go to the utility, but eventually they decided in 2015 that the best solution was to have these credits go to the site host. And that was partly based on they had experimented in 2011 in having the transit agency receive these credits. And so in 2018, they further clarified this, that the site host can designate another party to generate the credits on the behalf of the site host, as long as those two parties have a written contract. So some large businesses, colleges, government entities with many locations in the state want to be the credit generator or reporting entity, and they have to fill out reports to CARB, sell the credits to oil companies to generate cash. But CARB, like I said before, did not want these credits to go in claims, so this provision allows charging providers, other networks, or even independent third-party aggregators to be the designee and generate this. So it creates a lot of competition among parties to get these credits, but they all have to go to the site host, sign these contracts, and develop that. There are other types of credits out there, and I could briefly, in my 2 or 3 minutes remaining, just quickly go over them. The transit agency, for like buses, shuttles, light rail, subways, they also are a credit generator, and there's specific formulas for them. The forklifts are similar. The owner of the fleet is the credit generator, and any unclaimed extra credits are estimated by CARB and provided by the utility. So again, so the credits don't go and claim in the case of forklifts. And then there's a bunch of others for electric transport refrigeration units, electric cargo handling equipment, ocean-going vessels that plug in, and then there's a process. If you aren't eligible, you can apply to become eligible and get an EER, but that's a lot of work to go through and show. So, for example, things like mining equipment or agricultural tractors currently are not specifically allowed, but this process allows you to apply and generate credits if you want. Hopefully that can change in the future. It's a little weird because of this EER. All the other fuels, like if you're using natural gas or some other biofuel, you can generate credits for, let's say, mining equipment or agricultural tractors. For electric and hydrogen, it's harder because you have to have this EER, which is not so easy to get. Eileen mentioned incremental credits, and the basic idea there is to go better than the statewide grid average. So I was mentioning, typically for light duty vehicles, you're right around 20 grams per megajoule. So there's two different ways on the residential side. You can go less than that. You can use smart charging credits and link and have a reporting process to show that you're going less than 20 grams per megajoule, perhaps maybe even down to 10 or 5. Or you can buy RECs or do on-site solar or wind generation and even get less than that, potentially down to 0, maybe even less than 0 if you're using some biofuel RECs. It's very similar on the non-residential side. You also can do that, except the difference is on the non-residential side, there is only one credit generator entity. So if you want to get less than the grid average, you can do that, but you'll probably use RECs or this other method I just said. On the non-residential side, there are two separate entities. On the residential side, two separate entities generating credits, the electric utilities, and then another party. Typically, it would be the automaker that would get these incremental credits. And I say that because there's a bunch of reporting requirements by CARB. And one of the reporting requirements is to have the vehicle identification number or VIN number. And that number tends to be very accessible to the automakers. I'm probably oversimplifying. There's a lot of different ways to generate those incremental credits, but probably time does not permit me to get into all the detail there. And then just maybe end, the last thing I'll say is that the oil companies asked for and received a lot of additional requirements for verification in the 2018 version of LCFS, but those inspectors coming out and verifying everything do not apply to the electric provisions at this time. So I thought I would end there, that most of the other fuels have that. CARB decided not to put that on the electric provisions though at this time. So I think I'm at the 20-minute mark. I better stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean. Really, really appreciate it. This point would like to move into the panel, and we're going to hear from some organizations that are doing transportation electrification activity in the California market, and talk about how this policy impacts those efforts. We're first going to hear from Russ Musgrove, who is the Managing Director of Global Vehicles for FedEx. And FedEx, as many of you probably know, is making a lot of moves in the electrification space with their delivery vehicles. Russ, I'll hand things over to you now, and you should be able to share your screen if you have slides.
Perfect. I do have some slides here. I'm not seeing it pull up on the...
Dean, you may need to stop sharing.
Got it. Can you see it there?
Not yet. Here we go.
I got it? Good.
Yep.
Start it then. Perfect. So basically, I'm a managing director for Federal Express. I manage strategic strategy. So I have global responsibilities for all things that have wheels and doesn't fly. And we've been actively involved with electrifying our fleet for approximately about 12 years. So we've gone through kind of an evolution, both with our aircraft, starting with the small Falcon. The deregulation of the airline industry allowed us to now move globally with 777 and larger aircraft. On the vehicle side, our very first van was a Ford panel window van we purchased used in 1973, to now a significant number of electric vehicles around the world. So for us as a company, we're basically energy agnostic. We don't believe there's a silver bullet. We need a wide variety of alternative energy applications for both pickup and delivery, and then ground support equipment. Ground support equipment is that equipment that you see when you look out the window of your aircraft. We're actually one of the largest owners of ground support equipment in the world. We have compressed natural gas, electric vehicles, and then, of course, range extended electric vehicles and biofuels. So in our case, we don't really have a favorite, although one of the things that makes using electricity as a vehicle fuel very interesting to us is it has made a significant contribution to both the environment as well as overall cost. So our approach was a little different. We started in 2005. We put together a goal that said we'd have a 20% improvement in fuel efficiency by 2020. We hit that number significantly early. Right about 2011, we hit that first goal. We went ahead at that point and say, okay, we'll go 30% by 2020. And as you can see from the chart there, we hit that goal also extremely early, and then moved to a 50% improvement by 2025. You can see we're at 40.9 right now % improvement on fuel efficiency. One of the keys here, and one of the things as a private fleet that we had to move into is, at one time, when you go back to like 2010, we were paying 2.5 times for the same utility for an electric vehicle. At the time, the Department of Energy was putting out incentives, basically requiring an 80 kilowatt battery. It cost us approximately $1,000 per kilowatt, driving significant cost to the cost of a vehicle. So for the same utility we were getting with a gas or diesel vehicle, we were paying multiples for the price of the vehicle. So we did a number of POCs around the world to continue to gather information. Over time, we went to a right truck, right route strategy. We went with sub-3 liter diesel, natural gas, hydrogen vehicles to lower our overall, improve our overall fuel efficiency, but also to reduce our overall costs. While it's a great story to talk about removing, millions of metric tons of CO2, at the end of the day, when you're a full private business, you have to be able to show where the benefit is to the bottom line. And basically that's where we are. Two things have happened. One, I think it's critical for a fleet to set up and own and have an articulated goal, something that they're actually trying to accomplish. For us, it's pure fuel efficiency, basically because it's a simple thing for us to measure. California has been a significant part of us getting there, simply because we've utilized their HVIP programs and their credit programs to be able to offset some of the hundreds of millions of dollars we've spent over the years with different types of fuel efficiency technology, different types of fuel type technologies. So today we have moved on from doing a series of pilot tests. These are the pilot tests we do around the world, to one of the largest EV single rollouts ever accomplished anywhere in the world. We're looking at, right now we have construction projects going on where we'll be introducing 1,000 vehicles at one time into the state of California. Those first vehicles came off the line about 2 weeks ago. COVID has kind of thrown us a little bit behind. We've had 5 cases of COVID with our construction crews in California installing our level 2 and our DC fast chargers in our facilities. So we've been able to, so far, move along the project. This wouldn't have been possible to accomplish without support from the state of California, especially when it comes to making it reasonable to do those first large-scale introductions of electricity as a vehicle fuel. It's pretty straightforward to say that if you said what were the issues, getting vehicles to scale has been a significant issue. Many of the OEMs have went with traditional passenger, consumer applications. You look at the Tesla, the Leaf, these other types of vehicles. They went first with a consumer residential type customer, and they stayed away from the fleet customer. There's been traditionally a large number of small startups that worked in that medium duty space, which is where we are. The pickup and delivery business is actually ripe for electricity as a vehicle fuel. So we basically started a couple of years ago to work with our utility partners, which are a key component of us being able to do a large scale rollout, and then start the journey of identifying what that would look like over time. So developing an ecosystem and then replicating it, that's kind of what we're using California for as our laboratory. While we've done some significant rollouts in China, they're very different in how they approach utility. For us, getting vehicles to scale has been a constant journey. But working with utility companies that have a desire to sell electricity as a vehicle fuel, and then with municipalities, first responders, the entire ecosystem that make this possible, it's a significant piece. In the United States, traditionally, we have a tendency to use the carrot approach, whereas you look at states like California, New York, Texas, putting together really nice packages to incentivize you to to use electricity as a vehicle fuel or zero emission, hydrogen in some cases. What typically happens in the rest of the world is they have a tendency to say, okay, nothing but zero emission vehicles in the city center. If you come into this congestion zone, it's going to cost you $60 a day to operate there, unless you meet certain criteria, and that criteria has kind of been zero emission or other ways to incentivize us. So our current plan, we're in large scale introduction. We're going to be putting in thousands of vehicles, not hundreds. We started that journey in California, and at the same time, we're working to develop partnerships with utility companies, partnerships with cities and municipalities in general to ensure that we have all the things we need from an ecosystem perspective, training programs, first responder training, those sort of things, and then have a seat at the table with the regulatory folks to make sure that they're not doing things that hurt us in allowing us to be able to accelerate the introduction and acceptance of zero emission vehicles. So that's kind of where we are. We anticipate over the next 10 years that the vast majority of our vehicles, today we have about 85,000 road vehicles and about another 70,000 pieces of ground support equipment. We anticipate the majority of those going electric. Where a lot of fleets run into trouble is when you purchase a vehicle, an ICE vehicle today, a diesel or gas, you're going to maintain that vehicle for some period of time. So getting to where we can scale electric vehicles quickly keeps us from having to be always behind the curve. So we start off with 1,000 vehicles in California. We're looking at multiple thousands in other states. And then we're able to take that vehicles that we would have purchased a diesel vehicle, we purchased an electric vehicle, and we can start getting that process in place. So that's our journey. Our electricity is our fuel of choice right now. Again, we're fuel agnostic. There are duty cycles that don't really make sense. We do medium duty testing with hydrogen. We have hydrogen forklifts, hydrogen fuel cells on airports. Some countries around the world are pushing for hydrogen. Which is fine if the infrastructure will support it. Again, we're looking for those zero emission type vehicles where we can utilize and maximize the credits that we get. In states like California that are really progressive in putting together programs that allow us to share the cost of doing that initial scaling, will pay back with dividends. And that's it for me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And we'll move on to our next speaker, Martha D'Andrea with Los Angeles Department of Transportation, to talk about efforts to electrify transit buses in the LA fleet. And Martha, you're doing good. We're starting to see your screen. Looking good. Although right now I can't hear you. So possibly.
There you go. There you go. I forgot to unmute before I started up. Sorry about that. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Martha D'Andrea, and I'm head of specialized transit and grants for LADOT Transit. And I want to present our clean fuel policy and how we are funding our facility electrification. Okay. Now it's not moving. Oh, there we go. Okay. The City of Los Angeles Department of Transportation, LADOT, is the second largest transit agency in Los Angeles County behind LA Metro. We contract out our services. We currently have a fleet of 371 vehicles, and we primarily use CNG, but we still have some propane and gasoline vehicles. We currently operate 4 BYD battery electric low floor 35-foot buses since 2017. LADOT Transit operates 46 service routes between 2 fixed route services, Dash, which is our local neighborhood circulator, and Commuter Express, which is our AM/PM peak commuter services that operate on coach buses. We also operate a dial ride service, City Ride, and a microtransit service, LA Now. In 2019, LADOT carried 18 million passengers with a total operating capital budget of $120 million. I want to present the evolution of LADOT Transit's clean fuel policy. In April of 2017, LADOT drafted its own zero emission policy. And what that would have done would have required us to purchase 40% of any bus purchases in 2018, they would have to be zero emission. And then an additional 10% each year after, for a total of 100% of all bus purchases would be zero emission by 23-24. During this time, shortly after, we completed a market analysis to determine which types of zero emission buses we would operate: hydrogen, battery electric, or a combination of the two. The consultant looked at our service profile, such as the number of miles operated each day per route and our span of service. The market analysis determined that battery electric buses were the best fit for LADOT Transit. There were BEB manufacturers with the range LADOT needed, and the BEBs could charge overnight to avoid daytime demand charges. So in November of 2017, the mayor and city council passed a zero emission mandate where 100% of our fleet would be zero emission by 2030 or sooner, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, especially in our environmentally disadvantaged communities. Clean fuel means clean air. In addition, in 2018, the state passed the Innovative Clean Transit regulation, which requires all transit agencies to be zero emission by 2040. We had a clear direction and we were able to apply and were awarded a number of grants for buses and bus facility upgrades. LADOT is expanding service and reducing headways on our DASH system, which requires an additional 131 new buses. We received grants for the 131 buses plus the 24 replacements for a total of 155 battery electric buses. We have ordered 25 Proterra 35-foot buses and 130 BYD 30-foot buses. We were also awarded funding for facility electrification infrastructure. With buses on order, we needed to upgrade our facilities to power the BEBs. LADOT has 4 bus maintenance facilities, 3 that are city-owned and 1 that is leased by our contractor. The downtown facility was recently completed and we were able to add conduit during the construction. LADOT purchased 2 of its leased facilities, our Sylmar and Washington yards. We are trying to purchase the 4th and final facility in South Los Angeles. When you're investing $11 million in electrification infrastructure, you need to own the property. So a consultant was hired to cite and estimate the cost of electrifying our yards. The Sylmar and Washington yards will power 100 buses each. The cost to fully electrify the yard is $10.9 million per yard. You do not want to do this in a piecemeal fashion, like if you order 10 buses or an additional 5 the following year. It's best to have the plan, if you're going to go electric, to do the entire yard so you know what the costs will be as your buses come in. The costs include the inside the facility costs, such as design, chargers, electrification infrastructure, and equipment. We were able to receive $7.1 million in grant funding. First, from the State of California's Transit and Intercity Capital Program, TIRCP, which is a cap and trade program provided by the State of California. We also received an award from FTA's Bus and Bus Facilities Program, and then LADOT is using its 5307 funding allocation. But as you can see, we still have a $3.8 million funding gap. We are working with our utility, who happens to be a city department, the City of Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, to use LCFS credits to fund the $3.8 million gap per facility. We've been in talks with LADWP, and we're trying to see, how much is going to be available if we were to sign over 3 years of our LCFS credits. In closing, it's important to adopt a clean fuel air policy. This policy helps when you apply for grants. And as you can see, it's, you need to stack grants. So it's important to look at all kinds of grant funding sources in order to accomplish the goal of electrifying the yard. It's important to also complete a zero emission facility infrastructure plan for the entire fleet, even if you're not going to go fully electric or fully zero emission until a later date. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have one, and if you wouldn't mind stop sharing, we have one final speaker, Melody Black with Southern California Edison is our final speaker. Melody is a senior policy analyst at SCE and expert on all varieties of electrification. And Melody, we can see your slides and you're ready to go.
Great, thank you very much. I wanted to start by taking just a quick moment to review some of California's goals in case you are not as familiar with them. We have some very ambitious climate and air quality goals, and I've listed a couple of them here for you. First is reducing emissions below 1990 levels by 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. One of our goals is targeting 5 million zero emission vehicles on our roads by 2030, and then also obtaining carbon neutrality by 2045. Now, the reason I mention these goals is because at Edison, we serve approximately 15 million people within a 50,000 square mile area of central, coastal, and Southern California. And so it's really important for us to understand what is going to be needed for the state to reach those goals and how we might be able to assist them in attaining those goals. And so back in 2016, 2017, we conducted some analysis and published a clean power and electrification pathway, which was then later followed by a Pathway 2045 white paper. And I've included a link at the bottom of my screen here for you in case you're interested in reviewing either of those papers. And what our data analysis found was that for the state to obtain its goal of carbon neutrality by 2045, among a number of other things we would need to do, we would need to electrify about 75% of the vehicles on California's roads. What that equates to is about 26 million light-duty vehicles and over 1 million medium and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles. So that could be quite a number of electric vehicles coming on to our grid. So as we thought about the role that we as a utility should be playing to support the state's goals, we realized that we need to do more than helping influence the state policies, but we also need to help provide programs that would accelerate the market. And so we've requested and also received authorization from the California Public Utilities Commission to implement several different TE infrastructure programs. And I wanted to talk about two of our key programs for you. The first is our Charge Ready Light Duty Infrastructure Pilot. And in this program, we provide make-ready installation, or where we both build and install not only the utility side of the infrastructure, but also the customer infrastructure, which would include things like the panel, trenching, and the conduit on the customer side, up to, but not including, the EV service equipment. And through the end of last month, we've worked with customers to install around 2,700 EV charging ports at approximately 150 sites within our service territory. Of course, we're hoping to do more, and while we're not currently able to accept new applications for our Charge Ready Light Duty pilot at the moment, We are placing customers on a wait list because we have a phase 2 of our program. It's called Charge Ready 2, surprisingly, that is awaiting approval from the commission. And we're hoping to get some type of, or a decision from them sometime this summer on that program. The second program that I wanted to highlight for you is our Charge Ready Transport program. And this was just launched in May of last year. For this program, we cover the cost of all the infrastructure needed up to the charging station, so also sort of that make-ready approach, with the requirement that the customer needs to purchase or convert at least 2 fossil-fueled vehicles to an EV. So they need to do that up front to participate. We also offer for customers that are either in disadvantaged communities, or if it's a transit or a school bus, we will offer a rebate on the charging station, but again, that's only for those 3 categories. Our goal for this program is to install charging infrastructure at a minimum of 870 sites, and that would equate to us getting around 8,500 EVs either procured or converted out on the roads. And currently, we're working with 55 sites that would support up to approximately 1,300 medium and heavy duty EVs. We're hoping to do a little bit more, but with COVID, it's been a little bit slower start for this program. And so the programs that I just discussed, along with some of our other charging infrastructure programs, they're generally funded by our ratepayers through our general rate case. However, we recognize we need to do more than just focus on TE infrastructure. We also, in order to reach our goals, we really need to get cars out on the road. And that's really where the LCFS credit revenues come in that we're able to use the residential credit revenues as a way to directly incentivize EV adoption. And so our current program is SCE's Clean Fuel Reward. It's a mail-in rebate program, and it's for new and used EVs. The rebate was $450 through January of last year, and at that point we raised it up to $1,000. And as of June 30th of this year, we've issued over 107,000 EV rebates as a result of the LCFS credit revenues. That totals about $68 million that we've been able to issue out to purchasers of EVs. And so this has been a really great program for us because, again, it's helping us to accelerate transportation electrification with really no impact to our ratepayers. But I do have to let you know we are preparing to make a couple of changes. Specifically, as a state, we are in the process of moving away from having individual utilities like Edison provide utility rebates for the purchase of an EV. And we're moving to or towards a program where we would have a single statewide rebate program. This program would be not only administered, but also governed by the utilities. And so we've established what is, same name, the new statewide Clean Fuel Reward program. And for that program, it would provide any California resident who purchases or leases a new EV from a participating auto dealer with an automatic rebate at the point of purchase. And that's something that we're working on right now, but it hasn't been launched. We're hoping to get that launched sometime this year, but the timing is still to be determined. Now, because this program would be funded by a percentage of the residential LCFS credits that are being distributed to the electric utilities, as I mentioned, we would be responsible for governing it. And Edison not only volunteered, but the California Public Utilities Commission also authorized us to serve as the interim administrator for the statewide program. So while we are the administrator, which is, we are working with implementers to get the program up and running, we have established a governing or a governance committee that's comprised by the other investor and publicly owned utilities. And we've got a number of publicly owned utilities and investor-owned utilities throughout the state. And so we have a representative group on the governance committee that then is responsible for making some of the decisions for the program. To give you an idea about how much the utilities are contributing, the large investor-owned utilities contribute approximately 67 cents, or actually not approximately, they contribute 67% of their residential credits to support the state rebate. The medium and small utilities contribute a lesser percentage, and that it starts out a little bit smaller for the first couple of years, and then it grows slightly over time. Now, the utilities are authorized to use the remaining credits. So, for example, the large IOUs have 67%. That means we've got 33% left over. We're allowed to use that remaining percentage of credit revenues for other programs that would benefit EV drivers. And this past July, CARB updated its regulation to establish that 50% of those credits, at least by 2024, need to be used to support equity projects. And within that regulation, they established a list of eligible program options. And the options included things like electrification of drayage trucks, so providing rebates to support that, investment in mobility solutions such as EV, sharing and ride-hailing programs, and then also allowing the utilities to collaborate with local municipalities and environmental justice advocates to develop pilots or other plans that would support the development of EVs. And the California Public Utilities Commission is currently in the process of also providing guidance on that list. We are, while they've initially indicated that they're looking at a smaller list than what was proposed or what is within the CARB regulation, we're hopeful that they will either expand their list of program options or mirror those options that are available through the CARB regulation. And so that's something that is coming. And so as I close, I wanted to just re-highlight, we think that the LCFS credit revenues really provide a great opportunity to complement what utilities are already doing to support transportation electrification. We found that it's really helped us to accelerate, and provide an opportunity to incentivize EVs, at least within our territory, and I suspect the other utilities would say something similar within the state. There's also an opportunity, though, for the programs that the utilities offer within the state to be nimble and more responsive in some ways than we can be with our traditional utility programs, because these are funds that are not being, we're not having to increase our rates to cover this. And so these are programs that we should be able to implement much faster, provided that the regulatory process will support that expedited process. And that's something that we're working closely with our regulators to hopefully establish. And so with that, I think I'm done.